So the key elements of the structure of these organizations is that they are isolating. They're very hierarchical in that the leader calls all the shots, basically.
Mm-hmm.
But why do cult leaders do this? Well, they do it, I think, psychologically for their own benefit, to control their environment, that they're psychologically, that makes them feel safe to control other people. But they also then get what I refer to as fringe benefits from that control. That's why we worry about cults, because people become the kind of agents of the cult leaders' madness. Mm-hmm. So you get what I kind of think of as a charismatic bully. All cult leaders are authoritarian. If they weren't, they wouldn't make these horrible systems. They may often get financial rewards by exploiting people in the cult, free labor, and any other resources they can get. And by the way, at that stage, no one was supposed to come to our houses. That's part of the isolation. And this guy said, FBI, and I wouldn't talk to him. And he said, well, you'd talk to me if you knew there'd been a murder in this house, which I didn't know, but it turns out that was my dear, the great leaders doing. So you have all these levels of secrecy. So the people on the low levels don't know all the crazy stuff that's happening up at the top. And the people at the top who are dealing with the really crazy stuff, like Tom Cruise and John Travolta and Scientology, they've been in so long, they've long ago been lost touch with reality. And that losing touch with reality requires some conditions. And my kind of shortest way, my shortest formulation of that is you have to isolate people from their prior connections and from the, so to speak, real world or the outside world. You have to engulf them within your system, which means you engulf them in the belief system, you engulf their time, so they don't have time anymore to do anything else and have other hobbies and other interactions and other groups they deal with. And you state that your system is the good place. We are the good ones. Everyone else is bad. And then you have to introduce fear stimulus of various kinds. And different cults do that in different ways. You know, Armageddon is just around the corner, and usually it's that in some form. Or, by the way, you have badness inside of you that we're going to have to get rid of.
If you leave here, you're never going to know God or something.
Absolutely. Not only that, you're going to become a whore or commit suicide, or, karma's going to get you. So there's all these threats. And that's really, if you can do those three things, like isolation, engulfment, and creation of kind of constant fear stimulus, you can get pretty good at controlling people. You're told a lot of positive things, right? First of all, we're going to save the world, or you're going to get rich, or you're going to, whatever, have a good relationships. And there's a lot coming at you telling you that, right? It's like when the Brits voted for Brexit,
Yeah.
We're going to have the sunlit uplands, to quote Boris Johnson, who might be on his way back. God save us all. But, you're given a promise that's not just coming from the leadership, it's coming from the materials you're watching, it's coming from the other members, right? This is going to be just great for you. But you're also, when you express doubts, like, yeah, that's really good, but, this thing sounds a bit crazy. They're also going to then give you a very consistent message. In my group that I was in, it took the form of struggle with the practice. Or other ones are like, well, I've been dealing with a lot of Buddhist groups recently, and Matthew Remsky wrote a good book, which is titled Practice and All is Coming. It's the same exact message from, a Marxist group to a Buddhist group. just sit with the practice, just meditate longer, and it will come to you. This thing that you're having a doubt about is going to be resolved by just doing more. So the belonging part is you've got all these people who are who do, it's not just supposed, they share your goals, right? Like in the group I was in, all the other people in the group did want to be sort of revolutionaries back in the 70s when we thought that was how things were going to go in the world. We were mistaken, but, never mind. But, we did share the same goals. What wasn't, I believe who didn't share those goals was the leader, who I think was doing something else entirely. But the point is the people around you, you are thinking, oh, well, these are great people. These are the people I want to be with, right? So, which would be fine if you were in something that wasn't a cult. Again, that's a kind of normal human thing. It's not abnormal. It's just that the cult leader knows how to manipulate that to then close off all your other options and trap you. Because they have this particular personality, which I think is basically they're psychopaths. And you're right, they don't really relate to people as people. In fact, they kind of they use people as objects, don't they? And I think psychologically, it's very hard to research their backgrounds properly because they lie about their backgrounds and they don't easily subject themselves to people having a proper psychological kind of assessment of them. But from the bits of evidence, I think that they grew up in probably quite isolating, frightening environments themselves. And the way that they can feel safe as grown-ups is to control their environment very tightly and to control other people as part of that environment. And this is my hypothesis, not necessarily proven. So they're acting from a completely different psychological place than followers. And followers are a kind of range of psychologies. If there's another psychopath in the bunch of the followers, I think usually they tend to break off because they're going to present too much of a challenge to the leader. They're not going to comply.
Mm-hmm.
So you're right in that sense, but it's that we have to look at the leader as a different species, kind of, whereas followers are more in the range of various kinds of normal, not all perfectly normal, who do rely on other people in another situation may be a perfectly healthy manner. So if that helps.
No,
But who get under the influence of the cult, the followers get denormalized, shall we say. That's the whole process of brainwashing, is that the followers get unable to worry about their own survival. That's when they become what we call a deployable agent. All they can do is do what they're told, because their critical thinking has been disabled by the processes of what I refer to as brainwashing.
Yeah.
Well, it is very hard to understand unless you've done it, but once you've become isolated in the system and you're in this state of chronic hypervigilance and arousal of your cortisol system, and you're not thinking clearly at all because you're exhausted, you're in this chronic anxiety state, which, I also term it as a chronic relational trauma. So you can think of it as a kind of PTSD, but it's happening all the time. It's not post-traumatic. You're in this kind of constant low-level trauma.
Yeah.
Sometimes high-level trauma. Now, what we know is in trauma, your ability to use your critical thinking about the traumatic situation or relationship doesn't work. We know this from good science, right? They've done those lovely little fMRIs of the brain, and they can see that the part that sends your where you have a sensory inputs and you have a feeling, if we need to take care of that feeling, like for instance, I'm feeling like I don't want to kick out this relationship I've had for 30 years. The bit that would say, let me think about that more clearly. Let me think about that problem in my frontal cortex. Let me make a rational decision about this. That bit, that link in the brain that takes the feeling to the higher level part of the brain, does not work when you're in a state of trauma. It just doesn't light up under those nice studies that they do.
Well, and I think you see that too, like in situations like obviously now, like police are wearing body cams. We get to see a lot of high stress situations with the police. And sometimes these people make terrible, terrible decisions.
I'll say
In high stress situations. And I think it's sort of like we have this sort of like myth making. A lot of it comes from like war and masculinity and stuff, that, you know, it was a really high stress situation and he took the grenade and he threw it back and then he bayoneted the enemy and saved all these people or whatever. But I think, yeah, I mean, it's kind of bullshit that to imagine that people in like insanely high stress situations are always going to make the proper choice, or that they're even going to feel like they have a choice.
Well, what we know again about trauma, another way of talking about what I just described, is to say that people tend to get their fight or flight response is impaired, and instead they go into freeze mode. And that freeze mode is the same as that inability to think. So you're just, so when you know, often you see people in cults, so they just kind of a bit blank, you know. They may, what's confusing is that when they're not faced with the cult relationship, to think about that, when they're like maybe at their day job, say, if they have one, they might sort of be relatively normal. It's when they're trying to think about anything to do with the cult that's causing the trauma, that's when that freeze thing happens. So I like to say someone in a cult literally can't think about the cult and their involvement. They are just there. So if you think of being exhausted, chronically frightened, but you don't kind of know you're frightened and you don't know why you're frightened, you just have this physiological hyperarousal of your sort of fear systems. You're just trying to get through every day without kind of with your kind of like this, you know, like, don't hit me, you know.
Yeah.
Let me not put a foot wrong so I don't get punished, because that's going to happen in a cult. And so you're just trying to get by is what, and it may not look like that on the outside, but that is what's happening to people. And when you're in that state, you're like, oh, I'm told to get rid of my husband. All right, if it stops me getting hit, you know, it may not be a physical hit. And that may be indeed the punishment. If you did something wrong, you have to get rid of your husband. In fact, that's exactly what happened to me. So I know of what I speak.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the punishments are severe. So, but all of that stuff, all the fearful stuff, isn't being spoken or talked about because the belief system keeps saying it's kind of in complete contradiction to what you're actually experiencing, because the belief system is saying, so to speak, the kind of indoctrination and propaganda stuff is saying, we're fighting to save the world and we believe in all the good things and it's all going to be marvelous. You know, it's like during, you know, North Korea having these wonderful posters of chubby pink-cheeked children with their chickens while there's a terrible famine going on. You know, it's that in itself is crazy making, because there's nothing in this closed environment that you're in that is reflecting what's actually happening, which is you're exhausted, you're frightened, people are getting beaten, it's, you know, whatever's happening, nothing's reflected about that. And it's I mean, it's hard to understand for people, but it's important to understand, because
no, and I want to I mean, that brings something up too, where I mean, you're saying you know, people might be able to have conversations at work and not hit that like freeze mode or whatever. But I wonder, like in this story, you know, members of the cult have like come out publicly against me and the whistleblower and other
Yeah,
survivors or whatever.
you're Satan, I'm sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and said, I'm not in a cult. Like, I don't know why anybody would think this is a cult. And in the court cases that this little documentary is really about, the word cult comes up over and over again, and mostly people saying, like, I'm not in a cult. I don't know why anybody would say that. And I guess, like, I feel like I have some understanding of it, but I'd like to hear your response of just like why, once the cult question comes up, you have people who are in a cult who can articulate and express like why they are not in a cult, and the self-examination, or I guess maybe it's not self-examination, but group examination just doesn't really come out like in a way that you would maybe expect it would if this happened, if it was like just a workplace faux pas or something.
Well, they're not doing any examination. They're just protecting the cult because that's what's going to make them feel as if they're keeping themselves safe. So I don't know how. Yeah, they're not able, their critical thinking isn't working. So they're not going and saying, let me look up the definition of a cult. Oh, look, Dr. Stein says it's these 5 points.
Yeah.
Let me check them off. They're not, that's not, first of all, they're not going to be allowed time to do that. They may be blocked from the internet, but they know that's a dangerous thing to do. And if they said in public, oh, yes, I'm in a cult, they won't even get to that point.
Well, nobody in a cult knows they're in a cult, I guess.
No, they would get out if they thought it was a cult. Yeah, they would leave. And that has happened. I have worked with, someone who was locked up in the cult, but they neglected to take away his internet. And he was actually sort of born into it. And he was a clever chap. And because they locked him up and he had some free time, the worst thing a cult leader can do is give his followers or her followers, because there are female cult leaders, you don't want to give them free time, because people will, if given free time, often start to think. So you have to remember that these systems keep people busy, often on busy work, or you like meditating 10 hours a day, or digging ditches, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. You have to keep them busy, because if you let them have time, and particularly any access, like this person had access to the internet, he started Googling around. And then he kind of went, oh, maybe it's a cult that I've been born into. But he could only do that because he had time.
Mm-hmm. And you had no time. When you were, I guess, like, having read your memoir, like, a big theme once you are really in is that you just don't have any time ever, really. No. Like, throughout the whole course of the story, like, you don't have time. There's a brief window where you like go back to San Francisco, and it's kind of like this purgatory or fugue state where you see the benefits of both, and you eventually choose to go back to Minneapolis and jump right back into having no time at all. So yeah, I wonder with these people that sort of proselytize for the cult, once they know that, or they don't know it's a cult, but they know people are calling it a cult.
And one of the things that does, so I think it's really important to use the word cult for many reasons, which but when you're trying to help someone get out of a cult, it's not usually helpful, because they're already very shut. You're dealing with this person who's shut down, who can't think, and who's frightened to think. I think that's important to remember, that to think about the cult is frightening, because that's the source of your trauma. And that's a hard one to describe, but so it's frightening to approach the fear, the source of your fear. So that's part of the mechanism. So if you call it a cult, you're trying to push people into thinking about their group, which they can't do because it's too frightening. So the people who do what we call exit counseling, which I'm not good at, and I've always chosen to stay away from that. I haven't got the patience and the right personality for it. But people who do it are very patient, and it's a very subtle process where you don't challenge their relationship to the group, but you try in other complex ways that I'm not very good at to get them to think about their earlier life, if they had one before the cult, to maybe look at other things that have funny, bad dynamics, and get them to it's kind of almost do their own background processing. You're trying to kind of wake up their own.
What did you care about before you cared about this?
Yeah, and are you getting what you signed up for? I think that's one of, when you joined, what was it you thought you would get? Oh, I would get my whatever personal growth, and then gently try and say, have you achieved that? Like I say, it's a subtle, complex process that I'm not good at. But you don't say, oh, you're in a cult, can't you see how terrible it is? Because then it makes the freeze worse, that they're already, that's what you're seeing in that.
So our meeting is about to end. Do you think I could start a new one just to ask you? I want to talk about your, the terms you gave to in your submission to the January 6th committee, because I think that's valuable, and it's more valuable than putting a little infographic or whatever on the screen.
I could do that. Yeah, can we do it just another 15 minutes or something?
So absolutely.
Yeah. Otherwise,
I'll
get angry.
You want to do it at 8? At 8, is that okay?
Yeah, okay.
Okay, thank you.